So nice to have you all. I'm so glad you're here. Thank you for that, for waiting for me for just that little moment. For those of you who haven't met me before or been to one of our webinars before, my name is Amy Malloy. I teach mindfulness and yoga to all, basically, to everybody who would like to learn. And I also have a background working in publishing, working in developing materials in primary, and developing assessment tools as well for another education provider. So I've a lot of background in working with the CEFR, in working in materials development, and in working in young learners. A few years ago, I moved into well-being and working in this sphere, and now I'm really excited. Over the last couple of years, I've been able to draw the two together, working on developing materials for schools and helping teachers like you and students to understand how we can bring mindfulness and well-being practices into the school environment. So it's really lovely to have it in ELT as well. So thank you so much for having me. Today is the second in our webinar series. And we're going to be talking about curiosity and observing thoughts, which is the second in our mindfulness skills. So let's move through a little bit of housekeeping, and then we'll go from there. So today's webinar, if you missed something, we just want to listen over some things again, it will be recorded. So within the next couple of weeks, you'll receive an email with the recording link. And there's a certificate of attendance as well, which will be sent to you in the next couple of weeks too. So you'll receive an email with a personalised certificate. And any questions, I love to hear your questions. We will have some time at the end, just a few minutes at the end for some questions. So do feel free to pop them in the chat box, but also maybe note them down on your notepad or in your phone notes if you've got some questions, and we can deal with them at the end. Okay, lovely. Well, we'll be getting going. Hello to everyone who's been joining us. Thank you for the lovely comments. Okay, so what we're going to be learning about today is we're going to do a little bit of a review of the first webinar, just some of the content, because some of you might be joining us from a new, might be joining us for the first time, so we thought it'd be nice to put that into context for you. So we're reminding ourselves about what mindfulness is and why it's important for the ELT classroom in particular. We'll remind ourselves what are the key skills involved in mindfulness, and we will start looking at the second of those skills today. And we will look also, as always, we keep things practical. So we will be looking at how to bring these skills into your school. And all of the content here that we're looking at is backed up, and the messages are backed up throughout the year in the blog posts on english.com. And also in the introduction to mindfulness as well, the little guide booklet, which has all of these concepts written out as well. So with all of these different ways, you'll hopefully be picking up some of the basics along the way, but it's really nice to have the opportunity to talk to you in person about it. We'll also be looking at the barriers to practice and how to overcome those. So once perhaps some of you have started having a go by now, and so you might have noticed that there are a few things that are tricky that you might have come across. So we'll look at some of those. And then we'll look at the second phase in our practice plan for the year. So if you remember last time, we did the first plan about learning to focus. So let's get going and see where we get to. This lovely quotation from Steve Jobs, the founder of Apple. He said, if you just sit and observe, you will see how restless your mind is. If you try to calm it, you'll only make it worse. But over time, it does calm. And when it does, there's rooms to hear the more subtle things. That's when your intuition starts to blossom and you start to see things more clearly and be in the present more. So what we'll be looking at is this idea of, once we started learning to focus, we looked at autopilot, which and sitting in automatic pilot, and how to focus the attention to bring ourselves out of automatic pilot the first time round. This time we're going to be looking at what happens when we start to focus more. We got used to focusing, but we just sit in one place and we start observing, and maybe we start to see a bit more detail. Okay. So let's go back, take 2, all about mindfulness and why it's important. We'll just spend about 10 minutes chatting about this and then we'll move on, okay? So what is mindfulness? Some of you who have already read some of the materials or might have your own personal experience, or maybe were here last time, will perhaps now understand more about the answer, some of the answers to this question. We have this picture here. It's not here to demonstrate exactly what mindfulness is. It is here to demonstrate that this is just one of the many, many, many routes to mindfulness. So they are sitting cross-legged. The lady's on a pole, doesn't look that comfy. They're wearing their robes. They look very peaceful and calm. But what's important is that whilst this might be exactly how they need to practice, for them, in their culture, that might be completely appropriate. But it doesn't have to look like that or be like that to be mindfulness. And that's the most important thing. Anyone can practice it anywhere at any time. And equally, they might look like that, but if they're just thinking about what they're having for lunch or who's walking down the street next to them, then maybe they're not actually practicing mindfulness. They might just be sitting cross-legged with their eyes closed. So hopefully that gives you a little hint as to what we're talking about. And I find, since mindfulness and this campaign is about experiences, the best way is to have a go. So let's have a go. If you feel comfortable to join in, then I'd really love you to try this. If you would rather just sit and listen, or maybe have a go later with the recording of the webinar, then that's fine too. Okay, so wherever you are, maybe you're walking down the street, listening on your phone, maybe you could find a quiet place to stop, or you could just have a go walking along. If you're commuting on the bus, maybe you're sitting in an office, or maybe you're at home. So just having a nice place that you can just stop for a moment and pop yourself sitting down comfortably. Just have a little roll back of the shoulders, just feel nice and comfortable, okay? Then sit up gently, not too much effort, but just gently nice and tall. And closing the eyes, if that feels okay, or you can take a soft gaze down at the keyboard, or at your lap or the floor. And just starting to take a few deep breaths in and out. Just beginning to notice the effect of the breath in and the effect of the breath out. And just beginning to grow aware of the contact of your feet with the floor, and the contact that you might be making with a chair or sofa if you're sitting down. Just noticing what that feels like. Growing aware of some of the sounds around you in the room or outside. Seeing if maybe you can notice the sounds without pushing them away. Maybe we simply notice if they're loud or quiet. Maybe we notice if they're nearer or far away, high pitch or low pitch. And just allow yourself to allow those sounds to blend around you, to just come and go. And then taking your attention to your breath. And just taking a big breath in through the nose and out through the nose. And just noticing where you feel the breath moving in the body. Maybe you notice it most at the nostrils or the gentle rush of air against the lip. Maybe you notice it in the chest, rising and falling, or maybe right down in the belly, expanding and releasing. And just allowing your attention to rest softly where you feel the breath. And if the mind wanders, there's no right or wrong way to do this. Simply guide the attention back to the breath as soon as you notice the mind has wandered. It's a wonderful opportunity to come back to the present when we notice that the mind has wandered. Maybe counting each breath up to 5 could be a nice way to anchor yourself with the breath. And being kind in your inner voice as you notice your experience. Noticing if the air is cool on the way in or warm maybe. And then slowly coming back to the present moment, coming back, noticing the sounds around you, noticing your feet on the floor. And taking another big deep breath in and out. And just noticing how you feel, just reflecting on your experience. And welcome back. Thank you for having a go. I'd love to see how you feel. I'm really glad that we're really enjoying that. Some great feelings there. Lovely. It's okay if it wasn't, didn't feel so relaxing. Doesn't always. It doesn't need to. Lovely, wonderful. Thank you for those feedback. Relax, feeling lighter, beautiful. Back to reality. Lovely, great. So what's important to notice there is you were all sitting in different places. None of us had our robes on or were sitting on a pole. Well, I mean, I don't know, you might have been, but I doubt that's where you were. You hear and feel and smell more. What a lovely observation, Monica. Thank you for sharing that. Mindfulness, therefore, is the awareness that emerges through paying attention on purpose in the present moment and non-judgmentally to things as they are. So we draw out of that we're talking about the awareness that emerges. So we're not talking about how we go about it, we're just talking about that sense of clarity that you hear, your senses are clearer. I love that, Janaki, thank you. That was such a nice way of talking about it. That awareness that you get from sitting when you focus on the present moment, you pay attention to things as they are without judgment, then a certain awareness emerges, and that awareness is mindfulness. Okay, so as you can see, there's lots of different ways that you might go about getting there. Meditation is simply, think of it as a driving lesson on a quiet road as opposed to rushing down the motorway on your own in traffic. It's just a nice, quiet and efficient way to get your attention to the present moment, which is why it's so well used and so researched and so popular. But why is it important in ELT and now? In social media, things are getting very, very quick, aren't they? There's constant opportunity for comparing yourself with others, with your past self, with your inner self and outer self. It's an age of constant and instant information and expectation that you will communicate instantly. So there's just no time for the mind to rest. And the child and teen mental health crisis is at its worst. It's at its peak, definitely in the UK and the US. We were hearing last time as well that Poland has its own crisis starting to be experienced. So this is really a really important time to be starting to give the mind a bit of a break and find some other strategies to work with. But why in particular for ELT? Well, English language, as I'm sure many of you know, there's so many high stakes around it. English as a language has become attached to social mobility. It's attached to getting jobs, university places, visas for English-speaking countries, or even to work for international companies these days. The assessment around that is therefore really high stakes. So you're being tested. This idea of comparison is at the very heart of the ELT industry when you get into that space. And you're tested on a numbers level, on a framework. You're tested on the Common European Framework of Reference. Whether that's appropriate for your, particularly for children, it's not particularly appropriate in its existing original form. So there's a lot of comparison, often on frameworks, square pegs, round holes, trying to fit numbers into things that don't necessarily fit. And all of that is around pressure to achieve. Memory and language functions also get reduced when we're under stress. We don't need to be able to think creatively or remember things or use our language creatively when we are running away from a threat. Therefore, the brain and the nervous system shut down those language functions and those memory functions when we're under pressure and under stress. So for ELT, we're not going to learn efficiently, we're not going to acquire that new language in the same way if we're feeling stressed. But why mindfulness? Why can it help? So if we see everything real around this little girl here, her trees, the birds, the flowers, the grass, everything that's real around her. There's also around her lots of structures and social expectations around how she feels, what she looks like, the size of her house if she's an adult, how much she's going to earn, the work she does, the job she does, the scores in school. None of that is actually physically real, but it feels real and it will feel like it defines her. Okay, so there's the idea of something in this social structure that's created around us that isn't real. And what we do is we compare ourselves on those scales. And when we feel that we don't add up, we create stress, we go into fight or flight and into a state of anxiety on a more or lower, a higher or lesser scale, depending on the circumstance and the person. And mindfulness helps us recognize what's a real threat and what is perceived. So it helps us to see things as they are, as we saw before. And also the breath work we do with mindfulness to get us into that state of clarity regulates the nervous system in response to a perceived threat. So we get less stressed about what we see in the first place. Isn't that helpful? Specifically for younger children, our brains are malleable. That's what we know about our brains now. They're more like muscles. If you use them, they get stronger. If you use a network or a part of the brain, it will get stronger, it will grow more connections and synapses. Younger brains, the fewer changes need to be made in that space. It's in the process of developing, so everything's still growing and it's easier to train it into healthy habits. So it's much easier when we're young to calm the fight or flight response, to help regulate it, and to grow the prefrontal cortex, the rational brain, and how we process our thoughts to develop healthy habits in that area as well. So that idea then of not meeting a standard is just not viewed as a threat. Children learn a calmer and less critical way of experiencing the world, which is just so important. So let's have a look now at the key skills involved in mindfulness. So we looked last time at paying attention on purpose, focus and autopilot. So that idea of learning to focus the attention on one point in the present moment. That might be a point in the body, it might be the breath, it could be on a piece of food or fruit. We had a look at mindful eating. It could be on walking, so the sense of footsteps against the floor. So we looked at mindful walking as well. Something that anchors you in the present moment and practicing encouraging the attention to rest on that point, and whenever it wanders, to bring it back. what we're going to do today is look at observing things as they are. So once you've got to that place of rest, of sitting and focusing, what do you then observe? What do you then notice in that place, in that present moment? So the act of observing and being curious about what you see, that's a really key skill. And then going forward, we start to look at how to be non-judgmental about what we see. So finding some kind of acceptance. Things won't always be good in the present moment. Sometimes they might not feel as comfortable. How can we find acceptance and compassion for that? And that's what we'll look at in the future, and how we can bring that in the next webinar, and how we can bring that into schools as well. So let's have a look then at curiosity and observing the thoughts. The role of curiosity is really important in mindfulness. In order to demonstrate this and have a go, we're going to have a go at a little exercise here. I'd like you to look at this object on the screen in front of you and just reflect on what you notice about it. So just notice what you see. Maybe any assumptions that come into your thought processes, into your mind. Feel free to share in the chat box if anything comes up. Thinking it doesn't look like a real pen, so interesting. This is an assumption that it's a pen, a grey ball pen, a pen from a famous brand. So again, a brand, not a real thing. Shouldn't say that when working with a very, very important brand, but brands are social structures just like anything else. Just some of them are different to others. Yeah. So welcome, Alenka. So a blue pen, so we're assuming it's a pen. We've already tapped into that assumption of a brand. Stationery, a sense of fondness. Lovely. Has liquid inside, so making some assumptions there. But we're all saying that it's a pen, right? Great. Pen equals homework, so already getting a bit of a sense of association there. So what would happen now? What do you notice now? Have another look at it from this angle. Just interesting to see, so blue colour again. Noticing the blue ink. Same object, different perspective. Pen is mightier than the sword, lovely. An open pen, pen resting on a vase, blue pen on top of something, yeah. And see if we can just start to notice other things. Reminds me of summer, lovely, showing direction. Some of these completed work, happy, satisfied. Really lovely associations being observed here. So if you notice this activity, this action of writing this down, it belongs to a gym. It's a bar in a gym. Interesting. So it even looks different here. Lovely. Threatening. Interesting. So even this idea of writing this down and sharing is beginning to get a bit of objectivity in your observation of this, which is really interesting. And now we're going to move on. What do you see now? What do you think? Starting to notice, just looking at the picture, imagining that you've never seen this before. An eye, fascinating. Enlarged, a bullet, a light bulb, staring. Interesting. That's a light bulb, enlarged part of the same pen. Ouch. Poor pen zoomed now. No idea. Insect's eye, drop of ink. So it's the same pen. Yeah, you're right, but what do we see? Yeah. Just noticing a different perspective. Wouldn't guess it was a pen if you didn't know. Interesting. So if you've never seen it before, you might notice something different about that. Interesting. Lovely. Great. So that little activity was all about finding different perspectives, and I really enjoy some of the things that you've shared there, that different perspectives, different photos of the different angles of the same pen. So it was all a pen of a similar type, but actually looking at it from different angles gave you different perspectives, different associations. And mindfulness encourages us to stop, to look up, and to examine our surroundings and our thought processes with just that little spark of curiosity. I don't know if you notice that when you feel curious, it isn't that easy to feel negative. Have you noticed, would you say that curiosity generally feels quite positive? Even if it's just a tiny spark, just a little bit of a lift, that even if you're looking at something that might be less pleasant, if you're curious about it, it's harder to get into that negative space with it. And that's very, very fine, detailed observation, but sometimes it might resonate with some of you. With regular practice, our awareness grows clearer, and we begin to notice more and more layers to our thoughts and experiences. So just then, some of you noticed it was a pen. As we got closer in, you noticed the nib. Then you started to notice the ink. We started to notice more and more layers to the experience. It's a bit like walking into a dark room. As you wait there, at first you can't see anything, and then before long you start to get a bit of a sense of more things around you and start to see more in the darkness. So that's what curiosity can give us, and that's what mindfulness and curiosity together bring, because if we sit in one place and look for long enough, we start to notice more and more. I'd like to now introduce you to Dave. This is Dave. Dave is our friend today. He's going to guide us through what's going on in his head and his heart. So he has lots and lots of thoughts and feelings going on in his head, as to all of us. They're always in his head, whatever he's doing. So maybe he's here in having a cup of tea with his friend, and those thoughts and feelings are in his head. So he seems to be a nice guy. That's good to know. I'm sure he is. He seems quite happy. And those thoughts and feelings are going on, and they are maybe starting to influence how he views the situation he's in. Because if he's feeling in a certain way, they are affecting how he views that situation. So that external event of having a cup of tea with a friend, his thoughts and feelings that we saw here are actually part of how he is viewing that situation. They are the lens in his interpretation of that situation. And in turn, how he then feels about that situation. So his thoughts and feelings affect how he's feeling. And then, as a result of that, thoughts and feelings might occur off the back of that situation. And they might make an impulse to act. They might make him want to respond in some way. They might bring up physical sensations. Let's think about if we're running for the bus, and we're running to get the bus, and a car drives past through a puddle and splashes us, and we get all soggy and wet, and we're running for the bus, and we get all kind of hunched up like this, and we get there, and the bus is late, and it finally gets there, and we get on the bus, and we might just shout at that bus driver. We might just feel a bit grumpy and ugh. But imagine if you're walking to the bus stop and it's a really nice sunny day, have a nice calm walk, the bus pulls up, or maybe it's still late, but you don't mind waiting, you get on and you say hi. We are affected by our mood, by our thoughts and our feelings, and those thoughts and feelings that we were looking at before, that lens is influenced by everything that's come before us, be that years and years and years ago, be it 2 seconds before. And it's going to affect how we view the situation we're in, how we view that bus being late, for example. We might not mind about it, we might just be really, really cross and fed up. And then how we react as a result of that might change depending on how we're feeling, on our moods, on our mood, our feelings and our thoughts. So it's very easy in that situation to assume that those feelings and thoughts can define us, that they're facts about the situation, when actually the only fact about that situation in this picture here is that Dave is having a cup of tea with his friend. everything that he's putting on that situation, and we don't know the detail of that right now, is due to his thoughts and feelings on it. And that's what mindfulness helps us to see. We don't see the world as it is, we see it as we are. And that's from Danny Penman and Mark Williams. It's a really great, some really important thinkers in the world of mindfulness. And they've written a book called Mindfulness, Finding Peace in a Frantic World. And I'd really recommend having a read of that. It's got some great resources with it as well. And I love this quotation, that we don't see the world as it is, but as we are. So we're not looking at it, and our perception of reality is influenced and completely created by our thoughts and feelings about it in our own heads, which is so fascinating to me. When we think about sounds and thoughts, they're actually quite similar. This is how mindfulness can help us. So a thought is a sound. When you think about a sound, as we tried in our meditation at the start, we can assume that a sound is a particular object making that sound, okay? But when we break it down, what we can realise is that actually the sound itself is simply just a pulse, a quick pulse of brain activity when the sound goes in through the ear and recognises that as a sound. What we think of as the sound is everything that comes after that, the longer, slower series of associations and habitual patterns and thought processes that spread across a much wider and more varied network in the brain, okay? So we might think of a sound. So let's think of, say you are growing up in a small farming village in Europe somewhere in the Western world, and you hear outside your window, you hear galloping, you hear thud, 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 thud. You would assume, based on your prior experience, based on your associations, you'd assume it's a horse, right? And you'd probably be right, because that's generally what would make that sound in that part of the world. But say you're living in a small village in the Masai Mara in Africa, in Kenya, and you hear the same sound outside your window. It's less likely to be a horse. It's more likely to be I wonder if anyone's going to get a camel. It might be a camel, a goat, or what looks like a horse, sounds like a horse, different colour. Donkey, a zebra. Got there. It's more likely to be a zebra. It could be any of those things, to be honest, as you say. You've all made those associations. So a zebra and a horse, they probably sound the same. You're going to make a different assumption about what that galloping hooves sound is outside your door, outside your window, if you live somewhere with horses, generally there, or somewhere with zebras. So that's where we think that's a zebra, when actually all we're hearing is a pulse of sound vibration in the brain. The fact that it's a zebra is a full association. And our thoughts are exactly the same in how we think of a thought. Think of a thought. It's quite a meta situation. So the thought is a pulse in the brain. What we assume is the thought is all of the association that comes afterwards, all of the slower network of habits that we would think come after that, and that is the thought trail that comes after the initial pulse. But what mindfulness can help us do is start to notice that habit that comes after the thought, the string of assumptions, the string of associations. Decide if it's useful, decide if we want to follow it or not. So when the thought trail, when we don't catch it, say we feel sad, and you think you should be feeling happy, you notice that you're feeling sad. That little pulse, I feel sad. We then start to think, oh, but I should feel happy. We like to be in balance as humans. We like to be in a state of homeostasis, in balance. So if we feel one way too much, we want to balance that out and feel better. So I feel sad, I want to feel happy. You might then start thinking, oh, but I should feel happy. Am I happy now? I'm not happy yet. Don't feel sad. Why aren't I feeling happy? I never feel happy. I always feel sad. And so we go down this thought trail. It's much easier to go down a thought trail, a habitual process, than it is to stay in one place. It would be no point in reinventing the wheel every time. So our brain gets very good at creating habits and thought processes and sending us down it before we've even realised. What mindfulness can help us to do is sit and observe that thought trail, but having the choice as to whether we follow it or not. So rather than following it down there, we might have that thought of, I feel sad, but then realise actually that's okay. I don't need to change that. I can just sit there and watch it with my little thought watching binoculars on. How it can help children specifically, say they've got a thought pulse about, I've got a test today. That little thought pops into their head, that little reminder. That alone isn't anything, that's just a fact. There's a fact, isn't it? They've got a test today. But then you can run down that and go, do I know it all? What if I don't? I probably won't. That means I'm going to fail. I always fail. And therefore that core belief about failure, self-esteem, not being good enough is reaffirmed, all by the mind going blah, 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 and getting there before you've even realised it. And that's where, when we're in autopilot, these thought habits and spirals can go on under the surface and start reaffirming our core beliefs without us even noticing. So mindfulness brings us out and allows us, at that point where you can see the little red line, it allows us to notice what our lens is on the situation. It allows us to notice where our thoughts are. Thoughts are not fact. It allows us to separate out a little bit from them. Someone says, I think I identify myself too much with my thoughts and feelings. It's a really, really interesting observation. And just noticing that alone is a huge thing. We can think that our thoughts and feelings define us and they are the facts about a situation, when actually they're simply habits and associations that we have some control over. So let's get practical now. Let's look, as always, about how we can bring this into the school. Here are 3 activities that you can use to practice observing and being curious. The first is a curiosity exercise. Now this, you might notice, is pretty much what we did with the first exercise with the picture of the pen. So finding a familiar object, inviting the students to explore the object they have in front of them as if they've never seen it before, one sense at a time. So starting with the eyes open, exploring it with their eyes, with the sense of sight, and then maybe closing the eyes, exploring how it feels. And with the eyes closed, maybe give it a bit of a shake, see what it sounds like, bring it up to the nose, see what it smells like, and just explore an object with a beginner's mind as if you've never seen it before. And what this helps to do is allow your brain to get used to viewing things with curiosity, with interest, and a little bit of objectivity, rather than too much subjectivity, familiarity, and assumption that's already associated. So a nice activity might be to bring in a magic bag of objects that they can dip in, a mystery bag, of objects that they can dip in and they can pick one out of, or maybe get them in pairs to choose something for their partner in the classroom. It can be a nice 5-minute filler that's really, really good at helping the students to step outside their thoughts a little bit. The next one is a sound and thoughts meditation, so closing the eyes, softening the gaze, and listening to the sounds around. And rather than applying a label to them or pushing the sounds away, observing how loud or quiet they are, how near or far, maybe how high-pitched or low-pitched. And then you can also invite them to switch their attention to noticing their thoughts in the same way, whether they're pleasant or unpleasant. Or maybe you just want to stick with the sounds and try and observe both sounds and thoughts without following. The last one that you can try is cloud watching, as I like to call it. And this can be a nice one if it's nice weather to try outside. So to close the eyes and soften the gaze, or if you're outside, you could just stare at the sky. Just watch 10 breaths go in and out just to center and focus, and then begin to notice your thoughts. And imagine popping each thought onto a cloud as it comes into the head. Watch the cloud and the thought just float away as they come in and out of the mind, while all the time you just stay looking at the blue sky, the mind like a blue sky, and the clouds simply floating away. And it can really help to see that clouds and thoughts come and go in their own time, and we can choose whether or not to respond to them or to follow them. Now, we've got some recordings of these coming up onto the resources page in the next few weeks. So as soon as those are out, you'll be able to use them with your students and for yourselves as well. There'll be versions for you too. So let's look briefly at bringing it into school. We looked last time at the practicalities of bringing mindfulness into the classroom, so how you might set up a session. Just to review for those of you who are new today, that you maybe, you don't even need a special space. You can do it absolutely anywhere, be it 2 or 3 minutes at the start of a lesson at their desks. That's plenty of time just to be getting going. But if you have space and time, you want to bring it into the classroom and dedicate some time in a lesson to it, then you can. Maybe even a lunchtime club, but again, this isn't necessary, only if you want to. You might even want to bring it into the content of the course itself. So maybe use a body scan like we tried last time to learn body vocabulary, and we'll have some more resources around this too coming up. But one thing I wanted to look at today was the barriers to practice, because if you have been doing some mindfulness practice with your students, you might have come up, any new habit, any new practice is going to bring up a few little plateaus and things. So I thought we could address some of those together. So one barrier to practice that might be in a school setting in particular is opposition from parents or kind of theological, spiritual opposition to what might be deemed a spiritual practice. It does have roots in Eastern spiritual traditions, and some of the religions might come from a similar root ball that mindfulness comes from, if you think of it as a tree of philosophies coming off it. But this that we're talking about now is not a spiritual practice. There might be similarities, the kind of core, some of the things might be the same in actually the effect, but what we're talking about here is a secular practice. We're talking about breathing, relaxation, calming the mind and calming the nervous system. It's a practice that's supported by scientific research. So you might find it really helpful to look up Penman and Williams, as we just quoted at the top there. Look up Jon Kabat-Zinn as well. He has some great papers on mindfulness. And there's a growing body of evidence of mindfulness in schools as well. So you might even find that the term mindfulness is too much. And it has associations for some parents. So maybe you don't even need to make that big a thing of it. Maybe you can talk about relaxation, talk about breathing, talk about exam stress relief or stress strategies. Bring it into the language that works for your school and for your parents, and that will be key. Frustration or plateaus after a particularly successful start. Maybe you've had 2 times where it's felt really good and you felt super relaxed afterwards. And then you've got a busy head the next time, it just doesn't work, or the students are finding it frustrating. The key is to keep patient, keep consistent, keep going through the motions. It's a habit that needs to build, and a habit forms when we grow used to doing the same thing in the same context time after time. So at first there might be a bit of conscious effort around that, but in time it will become a habit. And it will become easier. So do stick with it, keep it as part of your routine somehow for your students, and in time they'll learn to just go with it and see what happens. And it's not always going to be relaxing and calming. It's going to be a barometer to the present moment, and sometimes we'll find good and calm in the present moment, sometimes we won't. And that's, as your mindfulness practice builds, you'll start to understand more of that. But just like you won't be able to run a marathon on day 1 of training, in the same way you need to keep training your mind, and eventually that awareness will grow. Time pressure as well is a big thing. So we've talked already about building it into course content, but plan it in, as we were just saying, make it sacrosanct. Even I said 5 minutes, even 1 minute makes a difference. And then maybe that will grow in time. But just start small and remember that the experienced meditator is not one whose mind doesn't wander, but one who becomes used to beginning again. Now we can refer to that as the mind wandering in a meditation. You could also think bigger and think of it as your practice. Okay, so maybe you have you think, oh, I've let that slip. Come back to it, come back to it, come back to it. And in time, you'll build it up. So just a little note before we come to questions on who might need some extra support. There are some contraindications for people, students, children with post-traumatic stress or perhaps domestic challenges at home. The act of focusing on the present moment could be too traumatic, too painful, and their nervous system will actually not let them. It will take them out. It will push that experience away quite violently. It might cause them to dissociate, so they just go into themselves, or it might cause them to become particularly panicked and over-aroused. So for students that have those challenges, it's best to stick to those more grounding activities like mindful eating, curiosity exercises, really focusing on maybe counting the breath like we did the first time, but really kind of very tangible practices. Some of these practices, like going and focusing on putting thoughts on clouds, might be a bit too reflective for that kind of student. So just keeping that in mind. Always keep activities short. Encourage the eyes to stay softly open if they want. Give them a choice whether they want to take part or not. There should never be force involved. To keep engaged with their environment and keep them grounded in the present moment rather than going off into scary thoughts. Attention deficit hyperactivity disorder and conditions on the autism spectrum. You might find that just having a chat with their SEM professional or their healthcare professional might help just to support their practice. But again, there's some benefits, lots of evidence around the benefits, particularly for ADHD, but do keep it short and keep the eyes open and keep them focused and in a calm environment to do that. Okay, so just a note as we move into these more reflective practices to keep an eye on those areas. Okay, just to keep yourselves safe as well. So going forward, we're constantly making guesses about the world and we're barely conscious of it. And that's what mindfulness helps us to do, be conscious of those guesses that we're making about the situation around us. When we start to observe the present moment, we become aware of lots of things, good and bad. Our minds learn to observe and accept both good and bad rather than panic. Mindfulness is like a gym for the mind. The more training, the fitter it becomes. So we'll be able to surf the waves, not expect them to stop. So the next stage in the plan of training in mindfulness practice is try this plan with your students. We're now moving into phase 2 of learning to observe. So a curiosity exercise to start with for the first week. Second week, maybe a sound and thoughts meditation. Again, we'll be providing recordings of these in the next few weeks, but feel free to use the notes in here and in the guide to get going if you want to. And week 3, maybe try a clouds and thoughts meditation. But if you're new to this, if this is your first webinar and your first introduction to what we're talking about today, then go back to phase 1 of the plan, look at webinar 1 and start with the body scan and the breath counting meditations, because otherwise students might find this a little bit too abstract if they've not first learnt to focus the attention, and stick with phase 1 as long as you need. After each practice, always encourage the students to write down or draw pictures for how they felt. You noticed when you started to write down your experiences earlier that it helped objectify a little bit what you had experienced. And you can even have conversation in the classroom in English or in mother tongue if that's easier. So that's it. Do you have any questions? I'm sure you do. I'd love to hear them. Thank you for the lovely comments. I'm so glad you're finding it useful. That's fantastic. Joanna has just popped the pocket guide to mindfulness here, which you'll be able to, it's a PDF that you can download or print out. So Adam's asked, is it possible to get the presentation to implement mindfulness step by step in my classroom? Yeah, definitely. The webinar will be recorded and the link sent out to all of those of you who've registered. We've also got most of the points here are also covered. In fact, all of them are all covered in the blog posts on English, www.english.com. You'll find all my blog posts on there, which cover all the points. So the webinar series of these 3 is taking you in a little bit more depth and giving us more time to chat and ask questions and experience the meditations as well. But the general plan, the general process will be in the blog post as well, and also in the mindfulness guide. And also, if any of you have also been on the experiences page, you'll notice that there's a podcast as well. I was really honoured to be the first interviewee on the podcast, the Pearson podcast. So go and have a listen to that, and it talks all about some of the basics there as well, and goes into a bit more detail. How to talk about yoga meditation in a rigid Catholic country? Vajna, I would say definitely. That's a really good question. Talk about talk about it as a secular activity in that context. So you might even not want to talk about meditation or yoga. Yoga and meditation are not religions. They do have some roots in a spiritual practice and more of a philosophy, really. The practices that we're talking about today have come from that kind of tradition, but what people like Danny Penman and Mark Williams and John Kabat-Zinn and many others have done is bring the neuroscientific exercises, the practices out of that, and really focused in a really secular way on how these practices, why they do work on the nervous system in the way they do. Looked at the science, they've tested it, they've experimented and explored, so that they can see that there's actually a very secular application to what were spiritual practices. So that's why I would say in that context, really focus on that. And even use different language around it if those words have spiritual connotations and might create barriers in your context. So as Amy said, we talk about ways of helping students focus and de-stress. Yeah, talking about practice and not meditations. Yeah, definitely. Okay. Just seeing a few more people typing. Yeah, don't use words such as yoga and meditation. Yeah, yoga. I mean, it's very interesting. All these words, they've been. It's only the connotations, the social associations around these words that might cause, cause some people to feel it as a barrier. As more you learn about it, you'll see that there's actually just quite a lot of similarities. A lot of the same ideas have popped up in the same place all the way around the world. And actually, what we're talking about here is really applying it to a purely secular context to help manage the stress epidemic that we're facing in the West. Work with adults in online classes. I think it's a bit more complicated to use mindfulness in this context, don't you think? Do you have any recommendations? Well, it's really interesting because so I use a lot of Oriental meditations in practice. Well, actually, so we're looking at the practice is focusing on the breath. And the practice is closing the eyes, but actually we didn't really use any Oriental language, any kind of Eastern spiritual language in what we were talking about. So there may be similarities, but there isn't any talk of spiritual practice in what we're doing. We're talking about going back to the online classes. We're working in an online way, aren't we? And we've managed to do some mindfulness practice here. So maybe you can use a link to a practice recording of some breath work to listen to and see what you find with that, and guide over a video forum if that works as well. I'd love to hear how you find that. Lovely. Well, thank you so much. I'd love to say that depends on the circumstances. If you have freedom as a teacher, learning becomes a happy adventure for kids and adults alike. There's no reason why these practices can't come into the classroom in the way that works for you, even if it's just doing a little curiosity exercise, and maybe just doing some calming breathing. However you want to try it, that's all that matters. So just one more minute. I've got just more training in the area. There's lots of resources online that you might find. There's a project called Mindfulness for Schools in the UK, which does some great training for teachers. I trained with a really lovely teacher called Shamash Aladina, who's done quite a lot of work on mindfulness for stress. So that's he does online programs as well, so you might find that helpful if you wanted to train to teach. There's a lot of resources out there. We've got resources coming specific for ELT. You could try apps like Headspace, Calm, and Smiling Mind as well. Yes, and the blog posts on mindfulness, there's some really practical tips in there as well, so do have a look. All of the materials we're creating in the Experiences campaign correspond with each other and they tie in. So depending on how you learn and what context you're in, read a blog post on the train, listen to this webinar again at home, use the recordings that we're going to put on the resources page soon as well in class. We're going to provide worksheets as well, so see how you get on. It's been a pleasure. And I'll see you again next time. Thank you so much, everyone. Do take care. All the best. Bye. Yeah, worksheets for students. Bye. Take care.